What if I told you that medieval kings didn't just control their subjects through armies and taxes? What if the most powerful weapon in a medieval ruler's arsenal wasn't a sword or a castle, but something far more intimate and manipulative? Welcome back to Life in the Dark Ages, where we uncover the brutal truths that history books often skip. Today we're diving into one of the most disturbing aspects of medieval political control: how rulers systematically used sex, marriage, and reproductive rights as tools of absolute power. Before we begin, I want to warn you, this video contains mature historical content about sexual manipulation, forced marriages, and reproductive control. This isn't about romance or love stories. This is about power, control, and the dark reality of how medieval rulers treated their subjects' most intimate lives as political chess pieces. We're talking about kings who decided who could marry whom when they could have children, and even how they could express their sexuality, all as methods of maintaining absolute control over their populations. From the Norman conquest to the end of the medieval period, European rulers developed increasingly sophisticated methods of sexual and reproductive control that would make modern authoritarian regimes look amateur. Today, you'll discover how the Norman kings used marriage as a weapon of conquest, how medieval rulers controlled peasant sexuality to maintain their labor force, the shocking truth about royal marriage politics, and why the church became complicit in some of the most manipulative practices in European history. This isn't just history, it's a masterclass in how power corrupts absolutely, and how the most intimate aspects of human life become tools of political control when people have no rights to protect them. Let's start with one of the most successful examples of sexual politics in medieval history: how William the Conqueror used marriage to completely remake English society after 1066. When William conquered England, he didn't just defeat Harold Godwinson at Hastings. He systematically destroyed the entire English aristocratic marriage system and replaced it with Norman control. Before 1066, English noble families had been intermarrying for centuries, creating complex networks of loyalty and land ownership. William saw this as a threat to his rule, so he did something unprecedented. He made marriage a political weapon. Within 20 years of Hastings, William had forced the marriage or remarriage of virtually every English noblewoman to Norman knights. This wasn't about love or even political alliance. It was about genetic and cultural conquest. Here's how it worked. William would seize English lands, then force the English heiresses to marry his Norman followers. If they refused, they lost everything. If they agreed, their children would be Norman, not English. Take the case of Judith of Lens, William's niece. She was married to Earl Waltheof of Northumbria, one of the last major English earls. When Waltheof was executed for rebellion in 1076, Judith immediately married Simon de Senlis, a Norman. Her children inherited vast English lands but spoke Norman French and considered themselves Norman. The numbers are staggering. By 1087, less than 5% of English land was owned by English families. The rest had been transferred through forced marriages, executions, and confiscations to Norman nobles. But here's what makes this particularly dark. These weren't just political marriages. William's administration kept detailed records of who married whom, when they had children, and whether those children were legitimate. This was reproductive surveillance on an unprecedented scale. The Norman chancery records show that William's administrators tracked noble pregnancies, monitored inheritance patterns, and even investigated cases where marriages weren't producing heirs quickly enough. The strategy was so effective that within 2 generations, the English aristocracy had been completely replaced. The children and grandchildren of English nobles spoke Norman French, followed Norman customs, and considered themselves Norman. What happened to English noble families who resisted? The Chronicle of John of Worcester records that families who refused Norman marriage alliances were systematically destroyed. Their lands were confiscated, their men were executed or exiled, and their women were forced into marriages or religious orders. By 1100, William's sexual politics had achieved what military conquest alone couldn't: the complete cultural transformation of England. The English language almost disappeared from official use, English customs were replaced by Norman ones, and English noble bloodlines were absorbed into Norman families. This wasn't just about one generation. The Norman system of using marriage for political control became the template for how medieval European rulers would manage their aristocracies for the next 400 years. The lesson: in medieval politics, controlling who could marry whom was more effective than controlling armies. William the Conqueror proved that sexual politics could achieve permanent conquest in ways that military victory alone never could. Now let's talk about something even more disturbing: how medieval lords treated their peasant populations like human livestock, controlling their sexuality and reproduction to maximize agricultural productivity. Medieval manor records reveal a system of reproductive control that was both systematic and brutal. Lords didn't just own peasant land, they owned peasant bodies, including their reproductive capacity. In the feudal system, peasants were bound to the land through serfdom, but what most people don't realize is that this bondage extended to their most intimate relationships. Peasants couldn't marry without their lord's permission, couldn't move to another manor, and couldn't even decide when to have children. Here's how it worked. When a peasant woman wanted to marry, her family had to pay a merchet, essentially a breeding tax to the lord. The lord would then decide whether the marriage was economically beneficial to the manor. Lords calculated these decisions like modern agricultural planning. They needed enough workers for planting and harvest, but not so many that they couldn't feed them during winter. Peasant marriages were approved or denied based on these calculations. The Ramsey Abbey records from 13th century England show incredibly detailed population planning. The abbey's administrators tracked peasant births, deaths, and marriages across dozens of villages, making recommendations about which families should be allowed to reproduce. But it gets worse. Lords also controlled peasant sexuality outside of marriage through a system called leerwight, fines for sexual activity without permission. If a peasant woman became pregnant outside of marriage, her family owed money to the lord. The court rolls of medieval English manors record thousands of these cases. Women were brought before manor courts for fornication, adultery, or bearing bastard children. The fines weren't just punishment, they were revenue generation through sexual control. Different regions had different systems. In some parts of France, lords claimed droit du seigneur, the right to sleep with peasant brides on their wedding night. While historians debate how often this actually happened, the fact that it was legally recognized shows how completely lords controlled peasant sexuality. Lords also controlled peasant reproduction through deliberate malnutrition. During difficult years, food was distributed based on productivity. Young, healthy peasants got more food to ensure they could reproduce. Older or less productive peasants got less, effectively controlling population growth. The Winchester estate records from the 14th century show systematic food rationing designed to maximize reproductive capacity among prime-age peasants while allowing older populations to decline through malnutrition. Peasants did resist these controls. Records show secret marriages, hidden pregnancies, and elaborate schemes to avoid merchant payments. But the consequences were severe. Families could be evicted, fined into poverty, or even separated. Take the case of Agnes the Redhead, a peasant woman in the 14th century Hertfordshire. When she married without permission, her family was fined 6 months' worth of grain. When she had a child outside marriage, they were fined again. When she tried to leave the manor, she was brought back by force and fined a third time. These systems evolved over centuries. Early medieval lords relied mostly on physical coercion. By the 13th century, they had developed sophisticated legal and economic systems of reproductive control that were far more effective. The economic benefits were enormous. Lords could plan agricultural production decades in advance, ensure stable labor supplies, and generate revenue through sexual control. It was human resource management taken to its logical extreme. When you compare medieval manor records to modern demographic data, the level of reproductive control was actually more complete than most modern authoritarian regimes achieve. Medieval lords controlled not just whether peasants reproduced, but when, with whom, and under what economic conditions. The terrifying reality? This system worked so well that it was maintained across most of Europe for over 600 years. Peasant sexuality remained under feudal control until the very end of the medieval period. But if you think peasant reproductive control was bad, wait until you see what medieval royalty did to their own families. Royal marriage politics turned princes and princesses into human chess pieces in games that literally shaped the fate of nations. By 1200, every major European kingdom was connected through a web of royal marriages, so complex that most rulers were related to each other multiple times over. This wasn't accidental, it was the result of centuries of deliberate sexual politics. Let's start with Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, and see how her sexuality was used as a political weapon by three different kings. Eleanor inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine at age 15, making her one of the wealthiest people in Europe. Within months, she was married to King Louis VII of France. But here's the thing, she wasn't marrying Louis, she was marrying France itself. The marriage contract didn't just unite two people, it gave France control over a third of what is now southwestern France. Eleanor's body literally became French territory. But Eleanor was too independent for Louis VII. When she failed to produce a male heir and started making her own political decisions, Louis had their marriage annulled. The official reason was consanguinity. They were too closely related. The real reason was that Eleanor refused to be controlled. Here's where it gets really wild. Within 2 months of her annulment, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, who became Henry II of England. This marriage gave England control over Eleanor's lands and created the Angevin Empire. Think about this. Eleanor's sexuality literally redrew the map of Europe. Her first marriage made Aquitaine French. Her second marriage made it English. 2 marriages, 2 different empires. But Eleanor's story gets even more disturbing when you look at what happened to her children. She had 8 children with Henry II, and every single one of them was used as a political tool. Her daughter Matilda was married to Henry the Lion of Saxony to create an alliance with the Holy Roman Empire. Her daughter Eleanor was married to King Alfonso VIII of Castile to secure the Spanish border. Her daughter Joanna was married to King William II of Sicily, then after his death to Count Raymond VI of Toulouse. These weren't marriages. They were international treaties written in human flesh. Each daughter's sexuality was traded for military alliances, territorial agreements, or economic benefits. The surviving diplomatic correspondence shows how medieval royal marriages were negotiated. Princesses were evaluated like commodities. Their beauty, fertility, intelligence, and political value were all calculated in precise detail. Take Joanna's marriage to William II of Sicily. The negotiations took 3 years and involved delegations from England, Sicily, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. Joanna's dowry included 30,000 marks of gold, territorial rights in southern Italy, and guarantees about her future children's inheritance rights. When William died childless, Joanna became a political problem. She was still young, still valuable, but now she was also dangerous, a wealthy widow with claims to Sicilian territory. So she was immediately remarried to Raymond VI of Toulouse to prevent her from becoming an independent political player. The complexity of these marriage alliances created inheritance nightmares that lasted for generations. Eleanor's grandchildren had claims to territories across Europe, leading to wars that continued for decades. The Hundred Years' War between England and France started partly because of marriage politics initiated by Eleanor and Henry II. Edward III of England claimed the French throne through his mother Isabella, who was descended from Eleanor's line. Medieval royal genealogies show that by 1300, European royalty were so intermarried that the gene pool was dangerously small, but they kept doing it because the political benefits outweighed the biological costs. The Catholic Church made fortunes selling dispensations that allowed closely related royals to marry. The papal registers record hundreds of these dispensations, each one essentially a license for politically motivated incest. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how royal women were treated as permanent political hostages. Once married, they could never return home, could never remarry without political approval, and could never make independent decisions about their own lives. Isabella of France, married to Edward II of England, was essentially a political prisoner for 20 years. When she finally rebelled and had her husband murdered, it was as much about personal liberation as political revolution. These systems reached their peak in the 13th and 14th centuries, when royal marriage negotiations involved dozens of kingdoms and could take decades to complete. Every royal birth created new political possibilities, and every royal death created new political crises. The ultimate lesson? Medieval royal sexuality wasn't about love, romance, or even personal choice. It was about power, territory, and the systematic use of human bodies as political instruments. Royal women were literally born to be traded, and their sexuality was a commodity more valuable than gold. Now we need to talk about the most disturbing aspect of medieval sexual control: how the Catholic Church became complicit in, and often the architect of, some of the most manipulative practices in European history. The medieval church didn't just regulate spiritual matters, it controlled every aspect of human sexuality across Europe. And what most people don't realize is that many of these controls were designed not for religious reasons, but for political and economic benefit. By 1200, the church had established ecclesiastical courts that handled all matters related to marriage, sexuality, and reproduction. These courts had jurisdiction over everyone from peasants to kings, giving the church unprecedented power over European society. Pope Innocent III, who ruled from 1198 to 1216, essentially turned marriage into a political weapon for the church. Under his reign, the church established the doctrine that all marriages required church approval, giving clergy power to approve or deny relationships based on political considerations. The papal bulls from this period show how marriage law was deliberately designed to maximize church power. The church claimed authority over marriage, divorce, inheritance, and even sexual behavior within marriage. Here's how it worked. Every marriage required church approval. The church would investigate the couple's bloodlines, financial status, and political connections before deciding whether to allow the marriage. This gave them veto power over every significant political alliance in Europe. The church made enormous profits selling dispensations that allowed marriages that would otherwise be forbidden. When King Philip II of France wanted to divorce his wife Ingeborg of Denmark, the church initially refused. But when Philip offered the church territorial concessions in France, suddenly they found canonical reasons to grant the divorce. Vatican financial records show that marriage-related fees, dispensations, annulments, legitimization of children, generated roughly 15% of total church income during the 13th century. Sexual control was literally a business model. The church also established elaborate systems for prosecuting sexual crimes. But these weren't about morality, they were about power and profit. Fines for adultery, fornication, and other sexual offenses generated massive revenue for church courts. The records of the Ecclesiastical Court of Canterbury show over 3,000 sexual prosecutions between 1372 and 1375 alone. The fines from these cases funded cathedral construction, clerical salaries, and church expansion. The church also used celibacy rules to control its own clergy's sexuality for political reasons. Celibate priests couldn't establish dynasties, couldn't pass church property to their children, and remained completely dependent on church hierarchy. But the enforcement of celibacy was selective and political. High-ranking clergy who were politically valuable were allowed to keep mistresses and acknowledge their children. Lower-ranking clergy were prosecuted severely for the same behavior. Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, later Pope Alexander VI, openly lived with his mistress and acknowledged multiple children throughout his career. But because he was politically valuable and financially generous, the church not only tolerated this, but eventually made him pope. The church also used accusations of sexual heresy to eliminate political enemies. The Inquisition prosecuted thousands of people for sexual crimes that were actually political dissent disguised as moral charges. The Inquisition records from southern France show that accusations of sexual heresy were systematically used against political opponents of church power. Towns that resisted church authority were accused of sexual deviance, justifying military intervention. The Albigensian crusade against the Cathars was partly justified by accusations of sexual heresy, claims that Cathars practiced free love and sexual deviance. Modern historians have found no evidence for these claims, but they provided moral justification for a political war. The church's sexual control systems evolved over centuries. Early medieval clergy had limited power over marriage. By 1300, they controlled virtually every aspect of European sexuality. By 1500, they had created the most comprehensive system of sexual surveillance in human history. The sacrament of confession became a tool of sexual surveillance. Priests were required to question penitents about their sexual behavior in explicit detail, creating a network of sexual information that was used for political purposes. Medieval confession manuals show that priests were instructed to ask detailed questions about sexual positions, frequency of intercourse, and private sexual thoughts. This information was recorded and could be used against individuals if they became politically problematic. The church's annulment system was perhaps the most cynical aspect of their sexual control. Marriages could be annulled for dozens of reasons: consanguinity, impotence, coercion, or even spiritual incompatibility. But annulments were granted based on political considerations, not religious ones. Long before Henry VIII, medieval kings regularly obtained annulments from compliant church authorities. The church granted these annulments when it was politically beneficial and denied them when it wasn't. By 1300, the church had become one of the wealthiest institutions in Europe, partly through its control of sexuality. Marriage fees, annulment costs, sexual crime fines, and dispensation sales generated enormous revenue that funded church expansion and political power. The Protestant Reformation was partly a reaction against church sexual control. Martin Luther's marriage to a former nun was as much a political statement as a religious one. It challenged the church's claim to control human sexuality. The church's sexual control began to decline in the 16th century as secular authorities reasserted control over marriage and sexuality. But for over 300 years, the church had used sexual control as a tool of political and economic power. The ultimate irony? An institution that claimed to represent moral purity became one of the most manipulative forces in medieval Europe, using human sexuality as a weapon of political control. So there you have it, the dark truth about how medieval rulers used sex to control their populations. We've seen the Norman conquest achieved through forced marriages, peasant reproduction controlled like livestock breeding, royal sexuality traded like international currency, and the church turning human intimacy into a political weapon. What's truly disturbing is how systematic and effective these methods were. This wasn't random cruelty. It was calculated political control that lasted for centuries and shaped the entire structure of European society. Medieval rulers understood something that modern people often forget: that controlling sexuality and reproduction is controlling the future. When you decide who can marry whom, when they can have children, and how those children are raised, you're literally engineering the next generation of society. In many ways, medieval sexual control was more complete than anything we see in modern authoritarian regimes. Modern dictatorships might control political speech or economic activity, but medieval rulers controlled the most intimate aspects of human life. The consequences of these systems lasted far beyond the medieval period. The aristocratic families created by Norman marriage politics ruled England for centuries. The peasant communities shaped by reproductive control maintained their structures until the Industrial Revolution. The church's sexual authority influenced European society until the modern era. And if you think this is just ancient history, consider how many modern political debates still center around controlling sexuality and reproduction. The methods change, but the underlying desire to use sexual control for political power remains remarkably consistent. What makes this history particularly important is that it's documented in extraordinary detail. Medieval rulers were bureaucrats. They kept records of everything. So we have thousands of documents showing exactly how these systems worked and why they were implemented. This is why channels like Life in the Dark Ages exist, to uncover the historical truths that explain how power really works. Medieval history isn't just about knights and castles. It's about understanding how political control actually functions at the most basic human level. If you want to learn more about the dark realities of medieval political control, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Next week, we're diving into how medieval rulers used food as a weapon. And trust me, it's just as disturbing as what we covered today. The medieval period wasn't a romantic time of chivalry and honor. It was a time when human beings were treated as political resources, when the most intimate aspects of life were controlled by others, and when power corrupted absolutely. Understanding this history helps us recognize when similar patterns appear in modern politics. Because the methods of control may evolve, but the human desire to manipulate others for political gain remains disturbingly constant. Thanks for watching Life in the Dark Ages. Remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how power works, so we can recognize it when we see it today.